A truck with blackout headlights rolls through a pine forest that isn't on any tourist map, its tires chewing frozen ruts like they're swallowing evidence. It's the late 1982nd, Soviet Union. And the driver doesn't know what's in the sealed metal crates behind him. He doesn't ask. At the checkpoint, a soldier with a fur hat checks a paper stamped with more red ink than words, then lifts the barrier without looking up. And inside the fence, there's a city that officially doesn't exist, so why is it being fed like royalty while Moscow lines up for sausage? This is a tour, but not the kind with souvenirs. We're walking through the Soviet nuclear weapons economy, the hidden network of closed cities, mines, laboratories, rail lines, factories, and favors that turned raw material into the most valuable objects on Earth. And 1989 matters because the system is wobbling, Perestroika is loosening the grip, budgets are tightening, and secrecy is starting to leak in tiny, dangerous ways. This isn't just about bombs. It's about how a country that couldn't reliably stock soap still found a way to build and maintain a nuclear arsenal. But here's what nobody tells you. The nuclear economy didn't run on rubles the way the rest of life did. It ran on priority. Start with the engine secrecy. In the Soviet system, secrecy wasn't just a security measure. It was an economic tool. If you can't see a budget line, you can't argue with it. If you can't name a city, you can't ask why it has better roads than yours. There were places where the train would slow, then slide past a turnoff, with no sign, no station name, just a guard and a gate. People called them closed cities, and the people inside called them home. A young engineer arrives with a suitcase and a letter he's told never to show anyone outside He's proud, terrified, and 24 years old. Because the offer isn't just a job, it's a separate universe. Inside, the apartment blocks are still gray, but the heat works more often. The stores quietly have more things. Not luxury, not abundance, but enough to make you feel the difference immediately. And that's the first clue. The Soviet nuclear economy was a country within a country, with its own supply lines and its own rules. But here's what nobody tells you. In a planned economy, priority is a currency. When planners decide what gets steel, copper, fuel, glass, skilled labor, and electricity, they're not just allocating resources, they're deciding whose reality will function. The nuclear sector lived near the top of that list. Not always openly. Sometimes the paperwork wore disguises, machine building, special metallurgy, research institute. But the effect was real. While ordinary factories fought for spare parts, certain workshops got them. While civilians waited for housing repairs, certain teams got new equipment crated and delivered like it was oxygen. And if you think that means everyone inside the fence lived like kings, wait for it, because the privileges came with a price that wasn't printed anywhere. Now picture the supply chain. A nuclear weapon isn't one thing. It's a long chain of. It starts with extraction workers in remote regions, digging and processing materials that most people never think about. It moves through transport sealed containers, guarded rail cars, schedules that don't appear on public boards. Then refinement, manufacturing, testing, maintenance, and storage, each step compartmentalized so that no single person sees the whole story, because the real price wasn't on the tag. The real price was in the silence. A miner in the far north comes off a shift with dust in the creases of his face, and he's told his work is patriotic, critical, historic. He believes it, mostly. He also knows he'll never be allowed to talk about the details at a family table without lowering his voice. His wage is decent by Soviet standard, but what he's really being paid in is meaning. And meaning is the Soviet economy's most powerful substitute when money can't describe value. But here's what nobody tells you. Nuclear weapons were never only a military project. They were a political economy. They created careers, protected ministries, justified factories, and kept entire towns alive. Once you build a secret city to make something essential, that city becomes essential too. It needs food, housing, clinics, schools, buses, spare parts, paper, ink, winter coats. So the nuclear project doesn't just consume resources, it drags a whole living ecosystem behind it. And that's where our tour gets interesting, because the nuclear economy has its own version of shadow prices. In the civilian world, shadow prices show up in whispers and street deals. In the nuclear world, shadow prices show up as hidden priorities, resources that appear as if by magic, because someone, somewhere, decided they must. A tool that would take months to allocate to a normal factory suddenly arrives in a sealed crate for a special workshop. A train car of high-quality metal goes one direction instead of another. A skilled machinist gets reassigned quietly because his hands are worth more than his title. But here's what nobody tells you. The nuclear economy had two prices for everything too. There was the official price, the one written in rubles on a form. And then there was the strategic price, measured in status, security, and fear. You could never walk into a store and buy deterrence, but you could build it. And in the Soviet leadership's mind, deterrence bought time. It bought leverage at negotiations. It bought the right to be treated as an equal on the world stage. So while a Moscow family counted coins for groceries, ministries counted warheads as political capital. And that's where it gets dangerous. When the value of something becomes infinite, the waste becomes invisible. Now, let's talk about the most desired goods in this economy without turning this into a manual. Because the point here isn't how a weapon is made. The point is what kinds of resources a weapon economy pulls toward itself like a magnet. Precision, purity, reliability. A consumer economy can limp with shoddy zippers and dull knives. A weapons economy can't. So the nuclear sector demanded things the rest of the country struggled to produce consistently. Precision machine tools, specialized electronics, high-grade materials, careful measurement. It demanded expert labor physicists, chemists, metallurgists, machinists, electricians, people whose skills took years to develop, and it demanded time. Because even in a system with propaganda, posters, and 5-year plans, nature still runs at its own speed. You can't order a process to be faster just because a committee wants it. But here's what nobody tells you. In a shortage economy, quality is the rarest commodity. So when the nuclear sector demanded high quality, it didn't just raise standards, it raised resentment. A factory worker in a civilian plant watches a shipment of good components get rerouted for special needs. His manager shrugs and says, "Not for us." He goes home to a kitchen with peeling paint, turns on a radio full of optimism, and feels something harden in his chest. Because he understands the hierarchy, not officially, but emotionally. And emotions are how economies become unstable long before they collapse on paper. Now we reach the part of the tour where the air changes. Risk and trust. In the black market, trust is built through shared need and fear of informants. In the nuclear economy, trust is built through clearance, compartmentalization, and the constant presence of security. You don't meet coworkers the way you do elsewhere. You meet roles. People are careful about what they say in stairwells. They lower their voices in kitchens, even when the windows are shut. They learn to live with the sensation that the walls can hear. And here's what nobody tells you. Secrecy creates its own kind of black market, not of goods, of information. Rumors about accidents, rumors about shortages inside the fence, rumors about which institute is getting new equipment, which one is losing funding, which one is being investigated. A nurse in a closed city clinic hears that someone in a nearby facility has been taken away after a procedural violation. No one says what the violation was. That's the point. Fear doesn't need details to work. And that's where it gets dangerous. When silence becomes policy, people start filling the silence with whatever scares them. Now add the other risk, human error. Any system built on perfection is haunted by the reality that humans are not perfect. Workers get tired, managers chase targets, paperwork lies to protect careers. A small mistake in an ordinary factory becomes a defective appliance. A small mistake in a special facility becomes a story nobody is allowed to tell. So the nuclear economy develops a culture of discipline that can look like pride from the inside and paranoia from the outside. The same culture that produces reliability can also produce cover-ups. And that tension between safety and secrecy never stops vibrating. But here's what nobody tells you. The most valuable thing in this economy wasn't the material. It was the chain of trust holding the whole machine together. A KGB officer sits at a desk under weak light, reading reports that are mostly banal, who missed work, who drank too much, who complained, who met a cousin from another city. Most of it is nothing, until one line isn't. Until one person starts asking questions in the wrong tone, and the officer knows something unsettling. In a system like this, loyalty is often enforced by vulnerability. Everyone has something that could ruin them, so people behave. Not always because they believe, because they're trapped. And that's where it gets dangerous, when compliance is mistaken for stability. Now, 1989. Perestroika's gray zone crashes into the nuclear economy like warm air hitting ice. Suddenly, the leadership is talking about reform, openness, restructuring. Suddenly, there are negotiations and treaties and new words in newspapers that would have been unprintable a few years earlier. Arms control becomes part of the public conversation, at least in carefully filtered form. And inside the closed cities, that creates a new kind of fear. Not fear of enemies, fear of irrelevance. Because if the country changes course, what happens to a city built for a purpose the country no longer wants to admit it? A senior scientist, hair thinning, eye sharp, walks past a bulletin board where someone has posted a newspaper article about reforms. He stops longer than he intends to. He remembers the pride of early breakthrough, the sense of being part of history. Now he feels something else, uncertainty. Because budgets can shrink faster than pride. And when budgets shrink, the invisible economy becomes visible in the worst ways. But here's what nobody tells you. Perestroika didn't simply liberalize. It destabilized the old guarantee. The nuclear sector had relied on a promise. Whatever else happens, we are a priority. But by the late 1982, the whole country is straining. Supply chains fray. Money loses meaning. The state's ability to deliver even basic services weaken. So even inside the fence, the stores start to thin. Even inside the fence, repairs take longer. Even inside the fence, people begin to whisper that the privilege isn't what it used to be. And that's where it gets dangerous. When a protected world starts feeling the outside world's hunger. Now, the gray zone expands. Cooperatives and semi-private ventures pop up across the Soviet Union, and some of them are attached to research institutes in awkward ways. People who have spent their lives inside a state system begin to imagine something unfamiliar, selling expertise. Not the sensitive kind, not the classified kind, but the kind that still has value, materials, science, precision engineering, specialized manufacturing. A young technician hears that someone's cousin started a cooperative making parts for civilian equipment and suddenly earns more than a senior engineer. His jaw tightens, not because he hates success, but because it reveals what the old salary system never admitted. Value was uneven all along. And that's the moment the nuclear economy's moral geometry shifts. Because the temptation is no longer just comfort, it's escape. But here's what nobody tells you. When an empire's finances crack, the most dangerous thing isn't weapon, it's people. People with knowledge, people with skills, people with grievances. Not because they're villains, but because they're human beings living through economic chaos. When stability evaporates, choices narrow. And that's where it gets dangerous. When a system built on control loses the money required to maintain control. Now comes the reveal, the thesis that ties our whole tour together. The Soviet nuclear weapons economy was a parallel economy. It had its own supply priorities, its own distribution networks, its own hidden budgets, and its own logic of value. It was a symptom of the larger, planned system, proof of what the state could accomplish when it treated something as sacred. And it was also a cause of civilian scarcity, because resources are finite, and priorities always have victims. Here's the aha comparison, and it's the kind that sticks. Imagine two workers in 1989. One is a teacher in Moscow, paid in rubles, spending hours in lines, rationing patients, cutting corners to keep her family afloat. The other is a machinist in a closed city, also paid in rubles, but surrounded by a supply system that quietly works harder for him than it does for her. Not because he's morally superior, because his sector sits closer to the top of the priority pyramid. Two wages that look similar on paper, two lives that feel radically different in practice. Two prices for the same concept, normal, because the real price wasn't on the tag. The real price was paid by everyone outside the fence who never got to vote on what the fence protected. And once you see it that way, the nuclear economy becomes less like a secret thriller and more like an economic X-ray. It shows incentives. It shows power. It shows how planning can achieve miracles in one lane while starving the others. But here's what nobody tells you. The nuclear economy wasn't efficient. It was effective at one goal. And effectiveness can be brutally expensive. The expense wasn't only money. It was opportunity. It was trust. It was a society trained to accept that some truths must remain unspoken for the greater good. Now, remember our cold open, the truck, the forest, the sealed crates, the soldier lifting the barrier without looking up. We go back there, but we don't go inside the crate. We don't need to, because what matters is what the crate represents. a promise the state kept even when it broke other promises daily. The driver pulls into a yard lit by harsh lamps, and men in heavy coats unload the cargo with a calm that comes from no cheering, no drama, just quiet urgency. A supervisor signs a form, taps ash off a cigarette, and turns his collar up against the cold. He looks like any Soviet manager you've ever seen, tired, practical, slightly irritated, except his paperwork moves faster than yours. And that's where it gets dangerous. When the most important parts of an economy are the parts ordinary citizens are never allowed to see. Because in 1989, the Soviet Union is a country with two realities. One reality is public posters, speeches, prices, fixed in place, like the state itself. The other is operational priorities, secrecy, unspoken trade-offs, a hidden system keeping the crown jewels polished while the kitchen runs out of soap. And as the decade ends, those two realities are colliding. The nuclear economy can't float above the country forever. It needs money, power, obedience, and functioning infrastructure. When those weaken, even the most secret cities feel the tremor. Moscow at night in the late Soviet years is a strange kind of quiet. The streets are wide, the buildings feel eternal, and the air tastes like exhaust in winter. Somewhere in the distance, trains move along rails that connect ordinary hunger to extraordinary power. And the people who built that power go home to small kitchens, close the curtains, and speak carefully as if the future is listening. Because it is. So here's my question for you, and I want you to answer it in the comments. If you were running a country under pressure, would you prioritize the weapon that protects the state or the goods that protect everyday life?